For over 200,000 years, an entire population of humans lived completely cut off from the rest of the world. They developed genetic traits so unique that scientists say they're at the extreme end of human genetic variation. What we just discovered about them is rewriting everything we thought we knew about human evolution. This is the story of the world's most isolated people and how their DNA is changing human history. For most of human existence, we believed that our ancestors spread out evenly across Africa and then eventually to the rest of the world. We thought humans mixed, migrated, and interacted constantly throughout history. But what if that wasn't the whole story? What if there was an entire population that simply stayed put for 200,000 years, while the rest of humanity evolved around them? That's exactly what researchers just discovered, and the evidence comes from deep inside our genetic code. In December of 2025, a team of international scientists published a groundbreaking study in the journal Nature. They had sequenced the genomes of 28 ancient individuals from southern Africa, whose remains dated anywhere from 10,000 to over 200 years old. What they found was absolutely staggering. Every single person they studied who lived more than 1,400 years ago had a genetic makeup that was completely outside the range of modern human variation. Even today, when we look at the most genetically diverse populations on Earth, we don't see the kind of genetic differences that these ancient southern Africans possessed. The research team, led by Matthias Jakobsen from Uppsala University, and including Karina Schlebusch, one of the world's leading experts on human genetic diversity, spent years analyzing this data. They compared the ancient genomes with genetic information from modern-day humans all across the world, from Africa to Europe to Asia to the Americas. The results painted a completely new picture of human history that no one had expected to find. These ancient southern Africans didn't just have different genetics. They had something scientists are calling the ancient southern African ancestry component. This wasn't just random genetic variation. This was a distinctive genetic signature that showed conclusively that these people had been isolated from other human populations for an extraordinarily long time. The most remarkable part? This isolation lasted for at least 200,000 years, and some evidence suggests it may have gone back even further. Think about that number for a moment. 200,000 years. That's longer than the entire recorded history of human civilization multiplied by 1,000. That's so long ago that it's nearly impossible for our brains to even comprehend the timescale. For comparison, the entire history of Egypt, from the pyramids to modern times, only spans about 5,000 years. The entire existence of written language on Earth is only about 5,000 years old. Yet this population maintained genetic isolation for 40 times longer than all of recorded human history combined. When other humans left Africa and spread to Europe, Asia, and eventually to the Americas, these people in southern Africa simply stayed where they were, while humans mixed with Neanderthals in Europe, while populations in Asia developed entirely new adaptations to new climates, while people crossed land bridges to populate the Americas. The southern African population remained genetically isolated. They didn't mix with these other groups. They didn't travel to other lands. They stayed in their homeland for hundreds of thousands of years. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. Scientists didn't discover this in ancient myths or in historical records. They discovered it in the DNA itself. The genomes revealed something that previous theories about human migration had completely missed. According to older scientific models, the ancestors of today's Khoisan people in southern Africa came from a population that was spread across the entire African continent. We thought these people were part of a large network of humans who mixed with each other regularly and shared genetic material freely. That theory was completely wrong. The new genetic evidence shows that southern Africa's prehistoric hunter-gatherers were not part of this wider African network at all. Instead, they formed their own isolated population that remained largely separate from the rest of Africa for hundreds of thousands of years. And despite being isolated, they weren't a tiny, struggling group on the verge of extinction. No, they were a large and stable population. They thrived in their isolated environment for longer than we can possibly imagine. Now, the question becomes, why? Why did they remain so isolated for so long? The answer lies in geography and climate. Southern Africa, south of the Limpopo River, became increasingly separated from the rest of Africa by environmental barriers. Climate shifts created vast deserts and challenging landscapes that made it difficult for people to move freely between regions. Genetic modeling suggests that southern Africa functioned as what scientists call a refugium, a favorable area where humans could survive through climate changes that were devastating other parts of Africa. While other regions experienced upheaval and migration, southern Africa remained a stable, livable region where people could stay put and thrive. The population that lived there adapted perfectly to their environment. They developed the skills and knowledge necessary to hunt and gather successfully in southern Africa. They passed down their techniques through generations. perfecting their methods of hunting, fishing, and gathering over countless centuries. They had no reason to leave. Everything they needed was right there in their homeland. And so they stayed, generation after generation, for thousands of years beyond thousands of years. But what makes this discovery even more revolutionary is not just the isolation itself, it's what that isolation did to their genetics. Over 200,000 years of living separate from other human populations, the Southern Africans accumulated their own unique genetic variants. Some of these variants are found nowhere else in the modern human gene pool. They are genetic differences that evolved in this population, and nowhere else. Among modern humans today, no other group carries the same collection of these ancient genetic variants that these Southern Africans possessed. The most intriguing discovery was what scientists found when they looked at specific genes. The research team identified dozens of genetic variants that are unique to Homo sapiens and were widespread throughout ancient Southern African populations. These weren't random mutations. These were specific genetic changes that occurred in this isolated human group and shaped their biology in profound ways. Many of these genetic variants are associated with kidney function, fluid balance, and the body's sweating response. In other words, they had genetic adaptations that gave them superior control over their body temperature and water regulation. Think about what this means. These people were so well adapted to their environment that they had literally evolved genetic superpowers compared to other humans. If you put a modern human from anywhere else on Earth in Southern Africa and compared their bodies side by side with an ancient Southern African, the ancient person would have had genetic advantages for surviving in that specific climate and landscape. Their kidneys would have been more efficient. Their body's ability to bounce fluids would have been superior. Their sweating response would have been perfectly calibrated to their environment. These weren't learned skills or cultural knowledge. This was encoded in their very biology, written into their DNA over hundreds of thousands of years of adaptation. This discovery reveals something profound about human evolution. We always thought of genetic evolution as something that happened over millions of years, something that only applied to ancient hominins or prehistoric ancestors. But here's the truth, that science is only now confirming. Humans, modern humans, Homo sapiens, continue to evolve. We develop new genetic adaptations. We change biologically. We accumulate genetic variants that give us advantages. And under the right conditions, isolated populations can undergo significant evolutionary change in just a few 100,000 years. The genetic isolation of the Southern African population continued until remarkably recently. For thousands of years, there was no admixture, no mixing with outsiders, no genetic influx from other populations. But then, around 1,500 years ago, things began to change. Genetic evidence shows that around the year 450, give or take a few decades, humans from other regions began to move into Southern Africa. They brought their own genetics with them, and slowly, over generations, genetic mixing began to occur. But even this mixing was relatively limited compared to what happened in other parts of the world. It was a slow, gradual process, not a massive invasion or migration. Interestingly, traces of the ancient Southern African genetic lineage appear in people from other regions thousands of years before this major influx occurred. Genetic signatures of Southern Africans show up in individuals from present-day Malawi around 8,000 years ago. This suggests that there were small-scale movements of people out of Southern Africa during periods when the climate improved and travel became easier. During the milder periods of Earth's climate history, a few Southern Africans apparently ventured northward, mixed with other populations, and left their genetic mark on people in neighboring regions. But these were exceptions to the rule. The vast majority of the population remained isolated. When you understand this timeline, it becomes clear why this discovery is so revolutionary. Humans have been around for at least 300,000 years, but exactly where our species originated and how we evolved has been one of the great mysteries of science. Previous theories suggested that Homo sapiens evolved in eastern Africa and only spread to southern Africa around 50,000 years ago. But the genetic evidence tells a completely different story. It suggests that southern Africa was a center of human evolution in its own right, a place where humans developed unique adaptations and maintained their own evolutionary path for hundreds of thousands of years. This challenges everything we thought we knew about human origins. It means that human evolution didn't follow a simple path where a group of humans evolved in one place and then spread out to populate the world. Instead, it was far more complex. Different human populations evolved in different regions, developing different adaptations, different genetic variants, and different capabilities. The modern human species is not the product of one evolutionary lineage, but of multiple populations that evolved somewhat independently before eventually coming together and mixing. The research team was meticulous in their analysis. They didn't just look at random genetic differences. They specifically examined Homo sapiens' specific variants, which are genetic changes that are unique to our species, and not found in our closest relatives like Neanderthals or Denisovans. What they discovered was that ancient southern Africans had a remarkably large fraction of these Homo sapiens specific variants. Moreover, these variants showed signs of having evolved rapidly on the Homo sapiens branch of the human family tree. In other words, genetic changes happened relatively quickly in this population compared to other human groups. When the researchers looked even closer at where these genetic variants were located in the genome, they found something remarkable. The genes associated with kidney function showed a particularly high concentration of these Homo sapiens specific variants. This is significant because kidney function is essential for regulating fluid balance and maintaining proper body temperature through sweating. These aren't trivial adaptations. These are fundamental biological processes that affect survival. The fact that southern African populations evolved enhanced versions of these systems suggests they were under strong natural selection pressure in their environment. What's fascinating is that modern humans today, even those living far away from southern Africa, might carry some of these genetic adaptations in diluted form. Some of these ancient variants may have made their way into modern human populations through that gene flow we mentioned earlier. So in a very real sense, the evolutionary legacy of these isolated populations lives on in people today. People living in Malawi, people throughout southern Africa, and perhaps people with ancestry from these regions around the world carry genetic echoes of this ancient isolated population. Now, southern Africa wasn't the only region where this kind of long-term isolation occurred. Scientists have been discovering evidence of ancient isolated populations in multiple locations around the world. The discovery process is relatively new, thanks to advances in ancient DNA technology. Just 5 years ago, extracting and sequencing ancient DNA was prohibitively expensive and technically difficult. But modern methods have made it possible to recover genetic information from ancient bones with unprecedented accuracy and detail. One fascinating discovery involves ancient humans from North Africa. In southwest Libya, at a site called the Takarkori Rock Shelter, researchers found skeletons that tell a similar story. Here, too, scientists discovered an isolated group of humans who lived for tens of thousands of years in northern Africa. While their relatives spread around the world and mixed with many different human populations and species, including potentially Neanderthals and other hominins, the people living at Takarkori remained isolated in their own region. The Sahara Desert, which we think of as a barrier, actually functioned as a natural boundary that kept populations separate for an extraordinarily long time. Only about 14,500 years ago did the climate change dramatically. The Sahara Desert transformed. It became a green savanna, lush with vegetation and water. When this happened, human populations were able to move more freely across the landscape. People from other regions of Africa, and even from Asia, began moving into the areas that had previously been closed off by the harsh desert environment. It was only at this point that the isolated northern African population began to mix significantly with humans moving in from other regions. The legacy of this ancient isolated group lives on in modern North Africans today, encoded in their DNA. Another remarkable discovery comes from Papua New Guinea, the second largest island in the world. A detailed analysis of ancient DNA from 42 people from Papua New Guinea reveals that some of the earliest cultures in that region were remarkably isolated for centuries at a time. The early groups that lived in Papua New Guinea showed little to no genetic mixing with their neighbors. There was minimal intermarriage. Populations lived in close proximity to each other, yet remained genetically separate. This suggests that cultural factors, social boundaries, or language barriers kept these populations from mixing even when geographic isolation wasn't preventing it. These discoveries around the world paint a consistent picture. Throughout human history, isolated populations have been common. For much of our prehistory, humans lived in small groups with limited contact with distant populations. Geographic barriers like mountains, deserts, and bodies of water kept populations separate. Even when groups lived relatively close to each other, cultural differences, language barriers, or conflict could prevent genetic mixing. Over time, this isolation allowed different populations to develop unique genetic signatures and different adaptations to their local environments. The implications of these discoveries extend far beyond academic interest. Understanding how isolated populations evolved helps us understand the diversity we see in modern humans. Human genetic variation isn't random. It's not evenly distributed across the world. Different populations carry different genetic variants because they evolved in different environments and remained isolated for different lengths of time. Some of the genetic differences between modern populations likely reflect adaptations that were beneficial in the ancestral environment, but may have different effects in modern contexts. For example, some genetic variants that may have been advantageous for kidney function and temperature regulation in ancient southern Africa might have different health implications for modern humans, living in completely different environments with different diets and lifestyles. This is why understanding the evolutionary history of different populations is important for modern medicine. As we develop personalized medicine approaches based on genetic information, we need to understand what genetic variants actually mean in different populations. The research also has implications for how we understand human migration patterns. For decades, scientists constructed theories about when humans migrated out of Africa, when they reached different parts of the world, and how they mixed with archaic human species like Neanderthals and Denisovans. But the genetic data from isolated populations suggests the story was more complicated than we thought. Human populations didn't migrate in coordinated waves. Instead, there were multiple populations evolving in different places, some relatively isolated, others mixing with each other. The pattern of human settlement and migration was far more complex and localized than previous models suggested. One of the most important aspects of this research is how it was conducted ethically. The researchers worked with indigenous communities and respected cultural sensitivities around genetic research. This is a huge change from the early days of genetic studies, when scientists would sometimes collect samples from indigenous peoples without proper consent or consultation. The scientific community has learned from past mistakes. Modern researchers recognize that genetic studies of indigenous populations should benefit those communities and should be conducted with their full understanding and approval. This ethical approach is particularly important in the context of misunderstandings that have spread online about certain isolated populations. There are numerous videos and articles making sensational claims about the DNA of uncontacted tribes, like the Sentinelese people living on North Sentinel Island in the Bay of Bengal. These videos claim that scientists have collected DNA samples and that this DNA is rewriting human history. These claims are not accurate. No scientist has ever successfully collected DNA samples from the Sentinelese people. The Sentinelese have maintained a policy of complete isolation and have actively rejected contact with outsiders, sometimes violently. What we do know about the Sentinelese comes from observations made from a distance and from historical records. They are related to other indigenous peoples of the Andaman Islands, such as the Ongja, Jarwa, and Great Andamanese peoples. Studies on these related groups indicate that they have some of the earliest genetic markers found in Asia. The Sentinelese are believed to have been isolated since the last major human migration out of Africa, approximately 60 to 70,000 years ago. Their isolation has preserved unique genetic traits, but without actual genetic samples, we cannot know exactly how different their genetics are from other human populations. The genetic diversity among Andamanese tribes, including the Sentinelese, is thought to be relatively low due to their small population sizes and long-term isolation. Interestingly, this low genetic diversity is actually a challenge for studying these populations through genetics. Small, isolated populations tend to accumulate certain genetic variants randomly through a process called genetic drift, where random changes in gene frequency occur simply by chance. This can sometimes make the genetic signal less clear compared to large populations. The videos making claims about Sentinelese DNA represent a common problem in science communication. Sensational claims get more views and shares on social media than accurate but more nuanced scientific findings. So even though the actual groundbreaking discovery is about southern African populations evolving in isolation for 200,000 years, the videos focus on the more exotic and inaccessible Sentinelese. It's a reminder to be skeptical of claims you see online about genetic discoveries, especially when they involve uncontacted or extremely isolated populations. The legitimate scientific discoveries about isolated populations offer plenty of genuine wonder without needing exaggeration or misrepresentation. The fact that humans evolved in isolation for hundreds of thousands of years is amazing enough. The discovery that isolated populations can accumulate unique genetic adaptations is profound. The realization that human evolution was more complex and varied than we previously understood is genuinely revolutionary. These facts don't need embellishment. The methodology used to reach these conclusions is worth understanding because it reveals just how sophisticated modern genetic science has become. Researchers extract DNA from ancient bones, carefully avoiding contamination with modern DNA. They use cutting-edge sequencing technology to read the genetic code with incredible accuracy. They then compare the ancient genomes with databases of modern human genetic variation from populations around the world. Statistical analysis helps them determine which genetic variants are unique to particular populations, which are shared across regions, and which are linked to specific genes and biological functions. The team led by Jacobson and Schlebusch had 6 individuals with very high-quality genome coverage, meaning they had read their entire genome many times over, achieving extremely high accuracy. 6 other individuals had medium-quality coverage, and the remaining 16 had lower coverage. Despite these variations in data quality, the pattern was consistent across all the samples. Ancient Southern Africans had genetic makeups that were outside the range of modern human variation. This wasn't a statistical fluke. This was a genuine, repeatedly confirmed finding. The study also used sophisticated genetic modeling to understand population history. These models can estimate things like population size over time, when different populations split apart, how long they remained isolated, and when gene flow from outside populations began. The modeling suggested that the southern African population was quite large until at least 200,000 years ago. This rules out the idea that it was a tiny isolated group that somehow remained genetically pure by chance. Instead, it was a substantial population, potentially containing thousands or tens of thousands of individuals that maintained genetic continuity for an extraordinarily long time. The genetic evidence also revealed something about the timing of the major transition away from isolation. Around the year 450, there's a clear genetic signal of admixture, mixing with outside populations. This aligns reasonably well with archaeological evidence showing increased human activity in southern Africa during this period. The climate had become more favorable, populations were growing, and people were moving more freely across the landscape. The isolated period was ending, and a new era of genetic and cultural mixing was beginning. What happened to these southern African populations after they began mixing with outsiders? The genetic legacy persisted. Modern Khoisan peoples of southern Africa carry a significant portion of the ancient southern African ancestry component. Some individuals have up to 80% ancient southern African ancestry, meaning most of their genetic makeup comes from the ancestral isolated population. Over time, through marriage and genetic mixing, this ancient ancestry was diluted as it mixed with genetics from other regions. But the signature remained, and it's detectable in modern populations today. This discovery has profound implications for how we understand modern human health and medical genetics. The genetic variants that were common in ancient southern African populations might influence health in different ways in different contexts. Some variants that were beneficial for temperature regulation in ancient climates might have different health effects for modern humans living in air-conditioned buildings and wearing modern clothing. Some genetic adaptations for specific diets might affect how modern populations respond to different nutritional environments. Understanding these ancestral patterns helps us make better sense of patterns we see in modern medicine. The research also highlights the importance of studying diverse populations in genetic research. For many years, the vast majority of genetic studies were conducted on European and North American populations. This meant that our understanding of human genetic variation was biased. We saw the patterns in these specific populations and assumed they represented all of humanity. But humans actually show far greater genetic diversity than these studies revealed. Populations from Africa, Asia, the Americas, and other regions carry genetic variants that aren't well represented in the older studies. This is why modern genetic research is working to include more diverse populations. The scientists involved in this research recognize that the findings challenge many assumptions that have been held in the field for decades. Karina Schlebusch, one of the lead researchers, stated that the genomes give a clear picture of the early population history of southern Africa. As more high-quality ancient genomes become available, researchers are beginning to understand human prehistory at a genuine population level rather than just inferring patterns from modern people. This shift toward understanding actual ancient populations, rather than trying to reconstruct the past from modern genetics, represents a revolution in how we study human history. The study demonstrates that southern Africa was not just a region that humans spread to after evolving elsewhere. Instead, it appears to have been an important center of human evolution in its own right. The unique genetic adaptations that evolved there over hundreds of thousands of years contributed to the diversity of modern humanity. The fact that these adaptations eventually mixed into other populations means that humans from very different parts of the world today carry some of the genetic legacy of these ancient southern Africans. This raises fascinating questions for future research. What other isolated populations might we discover as genetic technology improves? Are there other regions of the world where humans evolved in relative isolation for extended periods? What other unique genetic adaptations might we find? How many different evolutionary pathways did Homo sapiens follow before the modern era brought increased contact and mixing between populations? These questions are now driving the next generation of genetic research. The practical applications of this research extend into medicine, archaeology, and anthropology. For medicine, understanding the genetic diversity that existed in ancient human populations helps us better interpret modern genetic variation and develop more effective treatments for different populations. For archaeology, genetic data provides information that can be confirmed or contradicted by physical evidence in the ground. For anthropology, it reveals patterns of human migration and interaction that might not be visible in the archaeological record. As climate change continues to reshape our world, the story of the southern African isolation also reminds us of how profoundly environment shapes human populations. For 200,000 years, Environmental factors kept a population isolated and led to unique evolutionary adaptations. When the climate changed 14,000 years ago in North Africa, it opened up new possibilities for human movement and interaction. Climate has shaped human history in ways we're only beginning to fully appreciate. The significance of this discovery cannot be overstated. It fundamentally changes our understanding of how Homo sapiens evolved. It shows that our species did not follow a single evolutionary path, but instead developed along multiple pathways in different regions. It demonstrates that modern human genetic diversity reflects ancient isolation and adaptation. It proves that isolated populations can undergo significant evolutionary change. And it reminds us that the story of human history is far more complex and interesting than any simplified narrative can capture. For over 200,000 years, a population of humans lived completely isolated from the rest of the world. They evolved unique genetic adaptations to their environment. They developed distinctive genetic signatures that set them apart from other human populations. And when their isolation finally ended, their genetics mixed into the broader human population, spreading their ancient adaptations to people across Africa and beyond. Their DNA lives on in millions of people today, carrying the biological legacy of their ancestors. This is the legacy of ancient human populations, now revealed through remarkable genetic sequencing technology. This is how we're rewriting human history one gene at a time, uncovering the deep past hidden within our genetic code.